what I want to talk about is something, an issue that interests me in philosophy, and it's that anybody who comes to the history of philosophy in a UK university will maybe begin with Plato and Aristotle, jump from Plato and Aristotle to Descartes, and then do this big chunk of the history of philosophy, focusing really heavily on Descartes, Locke, Hume and Kant, skipping over Hegel maybe, and then into the 20th century and modern philosophy. And one of the reasons that I'm interested in this issue is because it seems to divide up the history of philosophy into these nice little compartments. And one little compartment that I've always had an interest in was the historical situation and the philosophical situation out of which Immanuel Kant emerged. One of my biggest research interests is in Immanuel Kant's second only to St. Thomas Aquinas. And something that we notice about this particular area of philosophy, it's known as modern philosophy as opposed to scholastic or pre-modern philosophy, is that the central concern is to do with the justification of knowledge and our knowledge claims. So it's to do with the justification of how our mental content hooks up with the world, some sort of extra mental reality, and how that mental content relates to it. And this concern was so strong that most modern philosophers that we read, Descartes, Locke, Hume and Kant, all took this problem to be of primary importance. So whereas our pre-modern philosophers all tried to focus on metaphysics, ontology, logic, philosophy of logic, our modern philosophers are really focused upon the epistemological issue of how our knowledge hooks up with the world. And so I'm really interested on why this came about, how this happened, how this shift to this predominant issue of the justification of thought came about in the history of philosophy. So in this lecture, what I'd like to do is propose a diagnosis for why the whole shift in philosophy came about, and to give a systematic analysis of this shift in philosophy, and to suggest that the entire framework within which the modern philosophical project came about is a flawed one, that framework needs replaced, because the adoption of that framework leads to certain problems, and the major solutions to those problems only come out when you assume this framework. And so the standoff between these competing solutions to the problems are all part and parcel of this same philosophical framework. But if we reject the framework, then the problems don't emerge, and so you're not really left with as many philosophical problems as you once were. So that's what I'm going to suggest. So what I would like to do is, first of all, offer a historical and systematic analysis and diagnosis of how the modern problematic in philosophy came about. And now, so bear in mind that the modern problematic in philosophy is the issue of how thought and reality hook up with one another, so how our mental content and our mental space of reasons relates to reality. So, to begin with the historical analysis, there are two trends of thought, two strands, cultural strands, which led to the modern revolution in philosophy. The first one is the rise of a mechanistic scientific worldview, and the second one is the rise of what was called Nominalism and late Scholasticism. So, in the pre-modern period, the scientific worldview was characterized by an Aristotelian picture of the world. And so in the Aristotelian picture of the world, what you had was a world made up of substances, it was made up of things, it was made up of trees, dogs, horses, humans, and so forth. And it was these things that we came to know. And so what you would do is you would investigate these things, you would find out something about them, you'd be able to categorize them within a certain classificatory framework. And in doing so, you'd be able to give a scientific explanation of the things that inhabited the world. But with medieval scholasticism and the various different interpretations of Aristotle that you had therein, and the competing different interpretations of Aristotle that you had, there began to arise a rejection of that Aristotelian picture of a world made up of substances. And what happened is a certain Democritean influence began to emerge in late scholasticism, which saw the world not as populated by these independent substances, these things that we know, but as populated by these atoms. And these atoms come together to form these substances. So what's really real then aren't these substances, these things, but the actual atoms that come to comprise them. And so scientific investigation has to be into these wee atomic entities which all come together to produce horses and trees and so forth. And with that then comes a certain philosophy of science that sees nature as simply built up of these wee atomic elements. And so what you can have then is the application of mathematical reasoning to nature, because these atomic elements then represent basic units of reality. And so nature is susceptible then to mathematical investigation, and so you can construct laws on the basis of mathematical principles which are able to explain nature. And that's brought to its zenith then in Galileo and Newton and so forth, especially with Newton and the various different laws of physics that he drew up. So that's one strand of thought that led to what I'm calling the modern revolution in philosophy. What did that entail for philosophy? Well, it entailed that insofar as the world, the real world, the world of science, the experimental world that scientists investigate, is governed by law and conformable to law. What you got then was a juxtaposition of this world governed by law from a space of reasons, a type of mentality which was not governed by law, which was susceptible to spontaneity, to wishful thinking, to all sorts of types of freedom of thought, which could not be conformed to this space wherein law and mathematical functions were at work. So what you had then was a separation of a mental space from the physical space that the natural scientists investigated, and this mental space was not susceptible to investigation by the natural scientists. They had all their mathematical functions which they applied to physical reality, and then you have this mysterious transcendent mental space. So that's one philosophical consequence that emerged of this new mechanistic world picture. Now, the other strand of thought that led to this revolution was the rise of nominalism in late scholastic philosophy. Now, nominalism is to do with the issue and the problem of universals and what the status of universals are. On the one hand, you have what were called the realists, and there were two types of realists. There was one type called the extreme realists, and they held that universals were real things which existed outside of thought. And Plato is a perfect example of an extreme realist, because Plato thought there were these real universals within which everything participated, and both the things that participate in the universal and the universal itself exist outside of our thinking of them. On the other hand, you have moderate realists who held that the universals were real, but they did not exist universally outside thought. They only existed individually outside thought. So universals were real. Every one of us is a human being. The universal humanity is real in every one of us, but does not exist universally in every one of us. It only exists universally in our thinking of human beings. But nevertheless, humans are all the same insofar as they are humans. And so that's a form of realism about universals as well. As opposed to that then, there was the nominalism. And nominalism is the view that universals aren't real, that they're nothing more than simply our thoughts about things. But these thoughts that we have, these thoughts about these universal properties, don't actually exist in the things themselves. It's just a handy way of our thinking about certain classifications of things. So none of us as humans have anything in common qua human. We simply have the same name, or Latin nomen, to refer to the class that we include ourselves in. And so what that entailed then is that philosophical problems with what our thought is about were associated with thoughts that we have in our head rather than with the actual objects in the world. So with realism then, there's a concern for the objects in the world and how to characterise those and how our concepts fit with those. With nominalism then, there's simply a concern for concepts and a lack of a concern for the things within the world. So we've got then the rise of a mechanistic worldview and the rise of nominalism. Both go to force the philosopher to think within a kind of mental space which is totally juxtaposed and separated off from physical space. This physical space is investigated by our mechanical scientists, and in this mental space, that's the space of the philosophers. That's where we do our philosophy. So what we get then is we get a fissure between mind and world. So we get this fissure, and the world, this space of fact, is simply put up here fact, which is mechanistic. And mind is a space of reasons, concepts, justifications. And there's this divide between the two of them. So man then, human beings, who do engage in thought about the world, when they do engage in thought, they are situated wholly within this mental space, talking about reasons, concepts, justifications, and they don't engage with the world. That's the fissure that's created by these two strands of thought that led up to the modern revolution in philosophy. And all it took then was a particular philosopher to drive a wedge then between the two of these, to separate them once and for all, and that philosopher was René Descartes. So Descartes comes along, and Descartes, fully appreciative of the mechanistic model of the world and being an accomplished mathematician himself, thinks to himself, well, when I'm thinking about the world, I have to be sure that my thought about the world is absolutely certain. I want the same type of certainty in my thought about the world that the mathematician can have in his thought about numbers. But mind and world are separated in this funny sort of way, so what can I do? Well, I have to focus simply upon my mental space. What I'll do is I'll focus on this mental space, try and find some sort of bedrock in this mental space, which will give me an Archimedean point, which will allow me to interact with the world in some way. Having done that then, he has this foundation out of which that he can build up all knowledge about the world. But the central point then is that our thought about the world is done primarily within this mental sort of space, and we're totally separated off from the world, and we need to find a bridge back over to the world. Now for Descartes, what that entailed is that we have representations into this mental space, and those representations are guaranteed by a non-benevolent God. The point is that you don't have to agree with Descartes' analysis of the situation, but the point is that Descartes inaugurates this revolution where there's an interface between mind and world. There's some sort of interface, and we have to find something which is homogeneous between mind and world, something which kind of bridges this gap between mind and world. And what we find then in modern philosophy is this notion that ideas bridge the gap. They seem to be Janus-based, and they go both ways, in a sense. They're both mental and worldly, and it's the ideas then that are taken to represent the world in some sort of way. So for Descartes, you're all familiar with Descartes' wax example from the Meditations? Yeah. Well, for those of you who aren't, Descartes talks about this piece of wax that he has, and he says, well, look at it, it's got a certain shape, a certain smell to it, and so forth, but if I hold it over to the fire, it's still the same piece of wax, but it completely changes. And so my sensory perception of its change does not guarantee my knowledge that this is the same piece of wax. What does guarantee my knowledge is that this is the same piece of wax is some sort of element within this mental space that allows me to hook on to this thing within the world. So perceptual experience then isn't our interface with the world, rather it's some sort of mental content capturable in terms of an idea which does allow us to hook on to the world. Now, Descartes was a rationalist, so Descartes thought that the best means of getting knowledge of the world by means of ideas was through some sort of a priori reasoning, some sort of rationalistic investigation. And this suited his temperament as a mathematician. But you might be thinking, well, empiricists, surely empiricists would say that there is a kind of perceptual interface between mind and world. And funnily enough, no, they don't. Traditionally, empiricists hold that what our perceptual experience of the world gives us is just this raw data, non-conceptual in and of itself, and we have to put it together within this mental space. So we take in this raw data through our perceptual experience, and then we put it together in some way, and we form these ideas of, well, whatever we experience, we form these ideas of it. So these ideas construct the world for us, but they don't properly represent the world, because the world is simply this set of atomic elements which can be described in mechanistic sort of terms. So these ideas stand one part away from what the actual world is like, and there are they're the intermediaries between mind and world for us. So they're the way in which we engage with the world. And so traditional empiricists then are even caught in this trap, where they situate knowledge in our engagement with the world wholly within this mental space, and they cut us off from the world. Now, probably one of the greatest philosophers of this period comes along, Immanuel Kant. And what Immanuel Kant realises is that, yes, we do have to have some sort of homogeneity between mind and world. There has to be something which kind of mediates these two things here, mindedness and world. And what Kant says is, rather than have this middle thing between the two that kind of hooks the one onto the other, perhaps we should just say the world just comes into conformity with mindedness. In other words, when we experience the world, our experience produces within us a certain type of matter which we draw from the world, and then on the basis of certain a priori forms and categories that we have, we structure that experience and we create the world. Okay? So our thought then is never about the world, our thought then is always about what we create within this mental space. And so this produced a full and complete revolution in philosophy, and this was on the basis of these two strands of thought. One, scientific mechanistic worldview, and the other, the rise in nominalism. And so I think one of the reasons then why you do, when you do come to study the history of philosophy, you begin with Descartes and you focus on that period, is that there was an entire and complete revolution in thought here, and it's one worth focusing on and one worth insisting on, because prior to Descartes and the rise of the nominalists, man's intellectual engagement with the world was never thought about in these terms. So for the likes of Aquinas, Scotus, even for Aristotle, they didn't think of man as being some sort of entity with a mind, with some sort of mind that engaged with the world. They thought of man simply as being an animal, and given the type of animal that man is, man has these certain abilities to simply grasp the intelligible content of the world. So for these thinkers, the world was thinkable in and of itself. It wasn't simply a collection of atoms put together. It was actually thinkable because it was built up of things that could be thought about. And so for our pre-modern thinkers, our intellectual abilities were simply able to hook onto these things that could be thought about. Whereas for Descartes and those who came after him, the world can't be thought about. The world has to be constructed in a sense. We have to recreate the atomic elements of the extra-mental world within this mental space. So what I'm going to suggest is that this conception of these two spaces, a space of reasons and a space of fact, which are totally juxtaposed to one another, leads to one of the biggest problems in philosophy, and leads to all these problems how the two interact, how our thought about the world could ever be justified or could ever be taken to be objective. I think that by creating this dualism, philosophy has gone astray and went down a blind alley which it needs to be led out of. Okay? So I'm going to suggest this entire revolution in philosophy has been one of the biggest problems in philosophy that we need to escape from, and I think contemporary philosophers should really attempt to do epistemology and do an analysis of the relationship between thought and world outside of this Cartesian and post-Cartesian framework rather than within it. Okay, so that's what my suggestion is going to be. Okay, have an easy task. So, we come to mindedness and this space of reasons and space of facts. And remember, they're separated off on this framework. So we have the two of them. So here we have a space of facts, here we have reasons. And the issue is, how can our thought be such that it is justified by our engagement with the world? And in other words, how can our thought objectively engage with empirical reality such that empirical reality justifies our thought about it? How can our thought meet the tribunal of experience, to use the language of Quine? Well, some would say that if you have a thought about the world, all you simply have to do is say, well, my thought says about that chair. What justifies my thought about that chair? Well, chair. Simply point to the chair and we say, well, look, that justifies it because there's the chair. My thoughts about it. The problem with that, what I think the problem with that is, following McDowell and Wittgenstein, is that whenever you just simply point to something in the world and say, my thought is about that thing, and that thing justifies my thought, really what you're doing is you're not giving a justification for thought. You're really just, to use McDowell's phrase, exculpating yourself. You're really just giving an excuse. You're really just pointing to something and trying to use that as an excuse to say why you're thinking about it. But that doesn't give you a reason for why you think about the thing. To have a reason for thinking about the thing is to be in a state whereby you can say, I am thinking about X because, well, X is the case. X is revealed to me as being the case, not simply being able to point at the thing. Pointing at the thing is simply ostensible knowledge. It's not rational justification for something. So the traditional empiricist view that simply pointing to reality or saying that empirical reality is somehow engaging with our perceptual faculties offers some sort of justification for our rational knowledge, I don't think is able to offer a fully coherent philosophical position about the relationship between mind and world, because what it ends up confusing is that it confuses facts, simple bare data that we get from the world, with actually reasons for thinking about how we engage with the world, and I think that's the problem. If you want to come up with that afterwards, please feel free. My reaction to this whole issue of the relationship between mind and world is to construe our intellectual engagement with empirical reality in terms of this thing called the mind and this thing called the world as two different things trying to interact with one another is to load the dice. In other words, if you're going to set the situation up in such a way that you've got a thing called the mind here and something called the world here, and you have to ask how they interact, you're always going to be led to some sort of representationalist problem where you're going to have to ask, how can the stuff that's in this side be suitably related to the stuff that's in that side? I think a better way to put it is to say that there isn't these two spaces, one of mindedness and the other of worldliness. There's just a single space. whenever we experience the world as being a certain way, as having a certain form or a certain structure to it. Even if you want to think of the world as a mechanistic collection of atoms, those atoms are still put together in such a way that what they form is some sort of entity whose identity is not the same as the identity of the atoms. It's the actual form or structure that those atoms take that form the identity of the thing in the world. Given that the form or structure that they take form the identity of the thing in the world, then the thing carries with it that certain identity, a certain intelligibility that can be distinguished from other things distinct from it. So it's not just one blob or connection of atoms juxtaposed to another blob or collection of atoms. It's a collection of atoms put together in a certain way in contradistinction from other things put together either in a similar way or in a different way. So things in the world have identity conditions. If they have identity conditions, they are identifiable by animals with the ability to engage intellectually with things. Consider an analogy. I've got a grasp of this pen. My grasp of this pen, the shape or the form that my grasp of this pen takes is distinct from the shape of the form my grasp of this eraser will take. So there are two different forms. My hand is formed in two different ways in order to grasp them. Now, in order to be able to grasp them, there are certain goings on at the physical level that happen so that my hand can grasp these different things and take on these different forms. Yet it can take on the forms and grasp the actual things that it's trying to grasp. Now, between my hand and the thing that it grasps, there's no intermediary. There's simply my hand and the thing that it grasps. So there's nothing that mediates between the two of them to allow me to grasp it. Now think of my hand then. Think of my intellectual abilities in terms of my hand trying to grasp the pen, and then think of the instrumental, the thing in reality, the entity with the identity conditions as the thing to be grasped. And you have kind of the picture that I'm getting at. What I'm trying to suggest is that humanity's intellectual abilities is simply like a hand grasping the pen. It can take on a certain form or a structure insofar as it can reach out and grasp the identity conditions of things. This can all be done on the basis of certain physical goings-on at a more fundamental sub-personal level, but all those physical goings-on are for the sake of this higher order type of grasp of the thing in reality. And all this can be accounted for without having to postulate some mysterious sort of mind or empty box into which representations of the world enter. So the moral of the story, I think, is that with Descartes and with post-Cartesian philosophy, you have for the first time in the history of philosophy the introduction or the invention of this thing called the mind. No philosopher, as far as I'm aware, before Descartes ever thought that there was such a thing as a mind into which representations enter. This idea of a mind, I can't find any sort of idea of it in the history of philosophy prior to Descartes. So with Descartes, the mind is invented. And I think Richard Rorty in Mind and the Mirror of Nature has a chapter actually saying, how Descartes invented the mind. And this leads to a problem in philosophy. It leads to all these very urgent problems of how mental content in this empty box called the mind relates to the world, and how we can have some sort of justification of the relationship between the world and the stuff within this empty box. My suggestion is simply reject that framework, reject that we do have minds, just focus on intellectual powers and abilities which are able to reach out and grasp the identity conditions of things in reality, and you don't have any bridge problems of how you get from thought to reality, because thought is simply the ability to engage in a certain way with reality on the basis of intellectual powers. And that's what I've got for you this evening. Thanks very much.